It's March 16th, 2022. 21 days ago, Russia invaded Ukraine. Throughout the war, we have been unable to get an accurate count on the number of casualties, civilian and military. We have tried to avoid sensationalizing these numbers so we don't attempt to offer a daily count. Those numbers are indeed important. They provide contrast to Russia's narrative that civilians aren't being targeted. In fact, we have a lot of first-hand accounts that prove otherwise, from telecommunications between Russian troops and their families or support teams to the accounts of civilians and journalists who have survived direct attacks. When you read or watch news on Ukraine, journalists will frame these reports as seeming to do something, that motives are indicated, claims suggest an alternative to official narratives. Journalists can report civilian casualties, they can take statements from witnesses and victims, but to make the leap to a definitive statement, to say that Russians are targeting civilians, that undercuts objectivity. It changes the narrative from factual reporting to editorializing. However accurate those editorials are, they sidestep an established code of ethics. News media is not, after all, meant to tell you how to think about something. You're supposed to receive a fact and interpret it through your understanding of how the world works. When you take an objective fact, that civilians are dying in this war, and place it alongside another narrative, like Russia's claim that civilians aren't targeted, a tempting rationalization occurs. Those civilian casualties through this narrative must be accidents. And we believe this narrative exploits journalistic objectivity. So we, on this podcast, firmly believe that with the abundance of evidence available, it is fair and accurate to say that civilians are open targets for the Russian military. We believe that the targeting of civilian infrastructures and residential buildings and neighborhoods is deliberate and indiscriminate. The evidence is overwhelming. As of March 13th, 2022, the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, has officially reported 636 Ukrainian civilian deaths, 46 of whom are children, 1,125 injuries, 62 of those are children. However, as of today, March 16th, the Mariupol City Council has officially confirmed that in Mariupol alone, 2,357 deaths have been recorded. 3 days ago, March 13th, 2022, a missile strike on a military training base in Yavoriv, Ukraine, resulted in the deaths of 35 people. 134 more were injured. Numerous factors make it difficult to get an accurate total of casualties, injuries, and deaths, and all of them have to do with the nature of war itself. Local officials, local numbers, are subject to logistical issues. The inability of local authorities to move freely throughout besieged cities in order to collect and count the war dead is a major cause of inaccuracies. That is, we simply don't know the full extent of civilian losses. Bodies can be buried under the remains of bombed buildings. People may be trapped in bomb shelters, and some people may die later from injuries sustained during a firefight or bombing. The same is true of official reports, like that of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Free travel throughout Ukraine is impossible, so verifying local numbers is also impossible. Keep in mind that people are also dying from natural causes during a war, accidents and illness as the war carries on. People with chronic medical conditions are having difficulty getting necessary medications. Some people are dying as a direct result of the war, but from non-injury. It was reported a week ago, March 8th, that a 6-year-old girl had died from dehydration after a bomb struck her home in Mariupol, killing her mother and leaving the girl trapped in the debris. The difficulty in reporting is one of verification, objective or neutral parties physically counting the war dead. There will always be an asterisk accompanying these numbers after a war has ended. In Mariupol, March 9th, 2022, the city began utilizing mass graves to bury their dead. Even covered by international media, the total number buried in the 25-meter-long trench is only an estimate. At least 70 people were buried. The mass grave is in a cemetery. Mass burials are done quickly with as much care as can be taken in wartime, but body bags run out and some are buried in sheets. The trench is so deep that bodies are dropped into it. And during the burial, the Associated Press reported that Russian troops began to bomb the cemetery. Even dead Ukrainians aren't dead enough for the Russian army. The sad truth is that the scale of this war will always be unknowable. Estimates are only that. We'll continue to report as numbers come in, but remember that they will never be a true total, and they are not the focus of this podcast. But they kind of are the focus of this episode. The attack on the Mariupol cemetery, the attack on those tasked with burying the city's dead, is part of an unfortunate trend of Russians targeting aid workers, humanitarians, and private citizens with no arms to bear against the Russian military. We have reported on the regular violation of ceasefires at attempted humanitarian corridors in Ukraine. We have reported on journalists coming under fire from Russian troops in Ukraine. And we have covered the story of 3 Ukrainian volunteers whose sole mission during this war was to deliver aid as needed. They delivered food and medicine to the elderly stuck at home, and on the day they were attacked by Russian soldiers, they were returning from a delivery of dog food to an animal shelter. We have also reported on the attempted shift in narrative, the real-time shift in narrative in Mariupol, where the democratically elected mayor, Ivan Fedorov, abducted Friday, March 11th, 2022, was replaced with a Russian-installed mayor, Galina Danilchenko, who then rebranded Mariupol residents defending their homes as, quote, extremists. We have also reported on the rise of Russian disinformation and propaganda attempting to disrupt international solidarity of Ukraine. And we can expect to see yet more propaganda emerge from Russian sources that will attempt to justify the attacks on civilians and humanitarian workers. We actually focus on that a lot. And that propaganda, if not meant to justify the attacks, then it is at least meant to sow distrust among Ukraine supporters. We have only to look at Russia's propaganda efforts against Syria's aid workers to predict where Russia will take the narrative from here. Netflix's 2016 short documentary, The White Helmets, which won Best Short Subject Documentary at the 89th Academy Awards, follows 3 members of the Syrian Civil Defense working in Aleppo, Syria. The Civil Defense Group is a humanitarian aid organization with 3,400 volunteer members. For the duration of the civil war, they have filmed their efforts to aid injured and trapped victims of the Russian-backed war. Without changing the focus of this episode too much, it's worth providing a little background on the war in Syria, namely that this is a war with multiple factions fighting over control of the country following the 2011 Arab Spring, part of a large opposition movement against the Syrian government and its president, Bashar al-Assad. The Arab Spring began small. Protests throughout the Arab world in January of 2011, calls for the removal of Assad, democratic reforms, expanded civil rights, but things turned bloody on March 18, 2011, when security forces, Assad's security forces, opened fire on protesters at the Amari Mosque, killing 4. 11 years later, the Syrian war has produced the largest refugee crisis of the 21st century, forcing 6.6 million Syrians to flee the country. Now, the Syrian civil war is, a big fucking mess. Iran, Russia, and Hezbollah support Assad and the Syrian armed forces, meaning they provide military aid including weapons and troops. The United States supports the Syrian Democratic Forces, providing money, weapons, and logistics. The fighting has spilled into neighboring Lebanon. The number of factions currently fighting in Syria is simply dizzying. You have Assad's Ba'athist government, you have ISIL or ISIS, Salafi jihadist groups such as al-Nusra and Tahrir al-Sham, you have Kurdish fighters, and then you have the Syrian Democratic Forces. All these groups, every single one of them, face accusations of war crimes, human rights violations, massacres by the UN and Amnesty International. There's also another issue at play. As this war has drawn out, fighters from one group may migrate over to another group. This has indeed happened. This results in a lot of confusion from global onlookers as weapons exchange hands and allegiances morph over time. In Syria, cluster bombs, chemical weapons, and thermobaric weapons have all been used, specifically by Assad's Syrian armed forces and specifically in residential areas. So now we can return to Russia. The side Russia chose from the outset was that of Assad's government. The protest in Syria began as a call for democratic reform, citing the Ba'athist government as corrupt and authoritarian. Assad made concessions when the protests intensified. This was after the March 18th murders of 4 protesters. He offered shortened mandatory army conscription. He fired the governor of Daraa, Faisal Ahmad Kulthum. Assad announced lower taxes, more employment opportunities, salary raises for public sector workers, and more press freedom. Writing for The Guardian in 2011, Fadwa al-Hatim, the pen name of a Syrian national, describes the reforms, quote, "The official and unofficial government media are always peppered with words such as civilized, progressive, and development, terms for something that is supposedly in a constant state of progress or transition. This is what we find today in Assad's Syria, with political reform always something that is to be studied and applied moderately but never actually implemented. Reform is the promised land that nobody will ever reach." End quote. In other words, those reforms never happened, and they never would happen as long as the Assad government was actively sweeping Syrian cities with machine gun fire while inviting citizens to vote. These are not the actions of a government undergoing a course correction. We have seen cluster bombs and thermobaric weapons already in Ukraine. If you haven't followed the weapons of the Russian army conversation, a thermobaric weapon is a rocket or missile system that releases a flammable gas upon impact, which is then ignited, and you know what? Human Rights Watch explains this much better. Quote, "The blast-kill mechanism against living targets is unique and unpleasant. What kills is the pressure wave, and more importantly, the subsequent rarefaction, vacuum, which ruptures the lungs. If the fuel deflagrates but does not detonate, victims will be severely burned and will probably also inhale the burning fuel. Since the most common fuel-air explosive fuels, ethylene oxide and propylene oxide, are highly toxic, undetonated fuel-air explosives should prove as lethal to personnel caught within the cloud as with most chemical agents." End quote. In other words, the shockwave of the bomb will kill you, and if that doesn't kill you, you'll burn to death. And if that doesn't kill you, you'll inhale the aerosolized fuel and suffocate. We have already covered the use of cluster bombs in Ukraine and the danger they pose long after war is over. It is a valid concern that Russia may use sarin gas or even chlorine gas. These are highly toxic nerve agents that can cause death, even in low doses, within 1 to 10 minutes. The White Helmets, that group of 3,400 Syrian humanitarian aid workers and all-volunteer group, caught the use of sarin gas by Russian and Syrian forces against civilians, and then they became the subject of the Netflix documentary of the same name because as part of their humanitarian efforts, the group captured footage, a lot of it, documenting the realities of the war on the ground in Syria. Their videos are a threat to the narrative of the Syrian and Russian governments that this is a peacekeeping mission only, that civilians are not targets of military strikes. The Syrian war has been ongoing for 11 years. 500,000 people have died as a result of it. Maybe. Like the number of casualties in Ukraine, we will never know the total number of casualties in Syria. The UN and the Arab League envoy in Syria put the estimate at 400,000, while the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights estimates a range of 494 to 606,000. Somewhere between 25,000 and 29,000 of these casualties are children. In 2019, the New York Times reported that the Russian Air Force specifically targeted civilian hospitals and medical facilities, including hospitals that the Syrian government was aware of. That is, they were on the deconfliction list. That is similar in theory to a humanitarian corridor. It's meant to prevent friendly fire on impartial or non-combatant personnel. The attacks on hospitals specifically are so bad that Syria has lost an estimated half of its total doctor population, about 15,000. In 2020, the Syrian Network for Human Rights estimated that over 855 doctors had been killed in the Syrian war, 669 of whom were killed by the Syrian military, 68 by the Russian military. The remainder, 40 and 36, by ISIL fighters and opposition fighters, respectively. That would be us, the US-backed democratic opposition. I told you this was a fucking mess. But back to those white helmets. Armed with GoPros and handheld cameras, the White Helmets have amassed an enormous collection of videos detailing the extent of the Syrian civil war. Hundreds of videos. You can go to their YouTube page now. I just clicked on a random video from February 27, 2016, 1 minute and 48 seconds long, 402 views. No narration, just video of what's happening. White Helmets are cutting rebar from atop a large pile of broken concrete, the rubble from a bombed building. When they have cut away enough rebar to move the concrete, they begin pulling bodies from the rubble. They carry them in blankets and set them in the bucket of a front-end loader. That's a construction vehicle with a large bucket on the front. Another random video, October 11, 2014, 2,463 views. 3 minutes in, and I'm watching a father cry over the body of his dead son, maybe 8 or 9 years old. The sheer volume of documentary evidence collected by the White Helmets alone has proved frustrating for Russia and the Syrian government. Amnesty International and the Syria Justice Accountability Center used the footage to back up first-hand accounts given to them by the people who lived through the airstrikes. They see that residential areas and civilians, children, are being killed by indiscriminate bombing by both the Russian Air Force and the Syrian military. And it's this same group, armed with GoPros and handheld cameras, that responded to and documented the chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun on April 4, 2017. The next day, the U.S. launched a missile strike from the Mediterranean Sea targeting an airbase. From The Guardian, quote, "It was the White Helmets footage that documented the chemical attack in Khan Sheikhoun in April, which killed at least 83 people, a third of them children. UN war crimes investigators later concluded the attack was carried out by the Syrian regime against its own people. Russian state media and a network of supportive alternative news sites continue to cast doubt on investigators' findings, describing it as, quote, illogical and, quote, deliberately staged by militants. The alt-right site InfoWars repeated the conspiracy theory describing the attack as staged by the White Helmets, who were described as a, quote, Al-Qaeda-affiliated group funded by George Soros, end quote. The White Helmets have never received funding from George Soros or any other of his foundations, end quote. A year later, in 2018, there was another gas attack, this time in Duma. You might think that hundreds of videos documenting the Syrian war by the White Helmets would win out over Al-Qaeda and George Soros, but Russian disinformation is very good. So good that the Alliance for Securing Democracy created a Russian propaganda tracker, the Hamilton 68 dashboard. It monitors 600 Russian-linked Twitter accounts and how they respond to global events. On April 7, 2018, the chemical attack in Duma, Syria, was once again captured on video by the White Helmets. 6 days later, April 13th, the US, Great Britain, and France announced a targeted airstrike on Syria's chemical weapons depots. The very next day, quote, on April 14th, accounts monitored on Hamilton 68 tweeted 33,139 times, a 35% increase from the day before and an 85% increase from the previous Saturday. The surge in activity was notable not only for its volume but also its focus. The day after the strikes, #Syria was by far the most used hashtag by monitored accounts, and 7 of the 10 most linked to URLs on Hamilton 68 focused on either the Allied campaign or the chemical weapons attack in Duma. Also of note were the 2 most linked to domains, Kremlin-funded outlets RT and Sputnik, end quote. The propaganda attack on the White Helmets was so successful that Googling, quote, Duma White Helmets, end quote, returns a first paid result of mostly accurate articles. Yahoo search engine churns out a 50-50 mix of truth and propaganda, and DuckDuckGo spits out, sadly, predominantly propaganda. The propagandized narrative is that the White Helmets staged the gas attack. They staged photos and videos. They staged a real gas attack as a false flag event. That the White Helmets are a terrorist group. That they actually murder the people they're supposed to help. That they are only in the work for the money. That other people actually do all the heroic work, and then the White Helmets take photos. It's a lot, all at once. It's hard to keep track of, and it's confusing, and that's the point. The Duma chemical weapons attack is the most propagandized event involving the White Helmets. Keep in mind that out of hundreds of videos, only a handful, like maybe one more, a video of a girl rescued from rubble who wasn't, quote, dirty enough, these are the only videos, quote, debunked by the Russian troll farm. But this type of propaganda works really well when the other side, the US, Great Britain, and France, conduct an airstrike that results in yet more civilian deaths. You don't even have to lie about that part. It's an atrocity by itself. This is not a case of 2 wrongs making a right. They don't. Please see the entire first season of Unfuck the Poor for ample evidence of us on this podcast calling out the US for war crimes. But moving on. As we've mentioned before, Russia's war in Ukraine may look haphazard on the ground. For one of the most feared militaries on the planet, they sure aren't making much forward progress, just an onslaught of increasingly devastating and desperate shelling. But Russia is waging another war online. Thanks to Hamilton 68, we can see the Russian disinformation machine is doing its best to combat its increasingly limited access to social media. Thanks to Hamilton 68, we can see today's top tweet from the Russian embassy In Japan, quote, a large-scale information war is now unfolding against Russia. Western media are unashamedly misinforming the site destroyed by Ukrainian forces and nationalist forces in Donetsk and the Luhansk People's Republic as a result of military operations in Ukraine regarding the indiscriminate bombing of Ukrainian cities. It is very reminiscent of the bombing of Tokyo on March 10, 1945, which claimed tens of thousands of lives, the US and NATO raids on Yugoslavia, Iraq, and Libya. Worthy disciples of the West, can anyone sympathize with Ukrainian Nazis even after yesterday's attack on Donetsk? End quote. I refer you to the 4 Ds of propaganda: distract, distort, dismiss, and dismay. We reported March 9th on the bombing of a children's and maternity hospital in Mariupol. If you've been watching the news, you may have seen some disinformation pop up about this attack. A photo of a pregnant woman walking down a set of stairs has been one target of disinformation claims. The woman was eventually identified as blogger Marina Ovsyannikova. Her Instagram beauty blog has clearly been filled with the images of an expectant mother, an authentic one, with baby clothes, baby toys, poses with her partner. The Russian embassy in London had the following Twitter exchange regarding the circulated photo of Ovsyannikova. Twitter username Charu Sally posted a picture of Ovsyannikova with the caption, "She is pregnant, you motherfuckers." The Russian embassy tweeted back, quote, "She is indeed, as she has some realistic makeup. She is also doing well with her beauty blogs. Plus, she could not be in the maternity house at the time of the strike, as it has long been taken by the neo-Nazi Azov battalion, who told all the staff to clear the place." End quote. From the same bombing on the same maternity hospital, more images and videos emerged. Another woman is carried out of the hospital on a cot. Her belly is bleeding and she looks confused. It was reported yesterday, March 14th, that the woman and her baby both have died. She has not been identified yet. But Russia's first deputy permanent resident to the United Nations, Dmitry Polyansky, said, quote, "That's how fake news is born," end quote. Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova said claims that Russia had bombed a maternity hospital was, quote, information terrorism. And Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "We do not fire on civilian targets," end quote. Regarding the bombing of the maternity hospital, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said, quote, "With regards to the maternity hospital, it is not the first time we have seen pathetic outcries concerning the so-called atrocities perpetrated by the Russian military." In the same press conference at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum, Lavrov said, quote, "Now we find out that secretly from the Ukrainian and the world community, military biological laboratories also function there," end quote. The disinformation machine that has targeted the white helmets, that has dismissed them as terrorists, that has worked to undermine and distract from their humanitarian, non-confrontational mission, to hide the atrocities committed by their own Russian Air Force as well as those committed by the Syrian military, the military they chose to support after it opened fire on its own civilians, that same disinformation machine, that same deep, urgent desire to distract from the truth, will be used to the same extent in its war against Ukraine, already is being used, to dismiss the suffering of Ukrainians. They have been called Nazis. A pregnant woman dies, and it is fake news. A maternity hospital is bombed, and now the concern is biological weapons. The disinformation and cynicism is as much a part of the Russian war machine as thermobaric weapons and cluster bombs, as much as staunch denial of targeting civilians, blaming its victims, is another part of that war. March 15th, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had this to say on the Russian propaganda machine, speaking directly to the Russian media. Quote, "The same goes for the propaganda system, the fourth branch of power in Russia. If you stay to work in propaganda, you are putting yourself at more risk than if you just leave, just quit. The risk of sanctions and an international tribunal for propaganda of an aggressive war for justifying war crimes. Quit. A few months without a job is better for you than a lifetime of international persecution." End quote. March 15th, 2022, the Polish, Czech, and Slovenian prime ministers met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky in Kiev, Ukraine. Poland said in a statement the trip was meant to, quote, "confirm the unequivocal support of the entire European Union for the sovereignty and independence of Ukraine. The aim of this visit is to present a broad package of support for Ukraine and Ukrainians," end quote. After the visit, Polish Prime Minister Mateusz Morawiecki called for the EU to grant Ukraine's candidate status quickly and emphasized Poland's willingness to aid Ukraine in organizing its defenses. Morawiecki called the war, quote, Putin's criminal aggression against Ukraine, end quote. A letter released by Ukraine's military intelligence suggests that during the Ukrainian occupation, Russia intends to engage in mass logging of Ukrainian forests in order to sell the lumber to support the Russian army. We previously reported on the deaths of journalists working in Ukraine to cover the war, and today we add 2 more names to that list. Fox News cameraperson Pierre Zakrzewski, age 55, and Sasha Kuvshinova, age 24, were killed in Gorenka, approximately 20 kilometers northwest of the capital city, Kiev. Fox News journalist Benjamin Hall was injured in the attack. Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, quote, the truth is the target. Russian troops fired at Fox News camera crew. Journalist Ben Hall survived but lost part of his leg, end quote. The crew was traveling in their vehicle when it came under fire by Russian troops. In Sumy and Kharkiv in the east and Donetsk in the southeast, humanitarian corridors were opened that allowed 28,893 Ukrainians to leave the heavily occupied areas. In Mariupol in the southeast on the Azov Sea, 20,000 citizens were able to escape. However, President Zelensky expressed frustration, recognizing that they were unable to provide mass evacuations. The 20,000 who had been able to leave did so in private vehicles. The situation is difficult, said Zelensky. They're trying every day. Indeed, the situation in Mariupol is grim. We have reported regularly on the worsening situation in Mariupol. The city of approximately 400,000 has been surrounded by Russian ground forces to the north, and the southern ports are blocked off by the Russian Navy. For over 2 weeks, residents have been without water, heat, electricity. Food and medical supplies are scarce. Today, the scene has become even more grim. Pavlo Kirilenko, head of the Donetsk Regional Military Administration, communicated via the Telegram messaging app, quote, the Russian occupiers have taken doctors and patients hostage. This was the news that one of the hospital employees has managed to pass on. He then relayed the message he had received, quote, it is impossible to get out of the hospital. They are shooting heavily and we are sitting in the basement. Cars have been unable to get to the hospital for 2 days. There are multi-story buildings burning all around. 400 people from neighboring houses were forced to come to our hospital by Russians. We are not allowed to leave, end quote. Russian troops had previously bombed the hospital, leaving much of it destroyed. Concrete slabs had collapsed, but the hospital remained in use, with administration having moved to the basement. Kirilenko called for Russia and all Russian citizens involved to be punished for the, quote, malicious violations of the norms and customs of war, these flagrant crimes against humanity, end quote. By Wednesday afternoon, March 16, 2022, Pavlo Kirilenko reported that even more citizens had become trapped after another Russian airstrike hit Mariupol's drama theater and the Neptune swimming pool. Quote, according to preliminary data, several hundred Mariupol residents were hiding in the drama theater. Their fate is unknown as the entrance to the bomb shelter is blocked by rubble. The Russians are already lying that the headquarters of the Azov regiment was there, but they themselves are well aware that there were only civilians. Now there are pregnant women and women with children under the rubble. This is pure terrorism, end quote. In Odessa, southwest Ukraine on the Black Sea, where citizens have been preparing for a Russian assault since the invasion began 2 weeks ago. At least 14 Russian naval vessels have been spotted approaching the Ukrainian coast. It's believed that the approaching vessels are landing craft, similar to those used on March 14th when they landed at Berdyansk. In what is becoming a common scene in Ukraine, the landing of Berdyansk was protested by locals the following day. Following the March 15th protest in Berdyansk, Vitaly Shevchenko, who works at a travel agency and helped organize the protest against the Russian invasion, was detained by the Russian military along with other protesters. In a video posted to YouTube, Shevchenko can be seen being walked out of a cafe with several Russian troops. A vehicle with the now infamous Z logo on its rear window is parked outside. In good news, in fact, a huge sigh of relief kind of good news, we're happy to report that we were 100% wrong in our prediction of the fate of Melitopol Mayor Ivan Fedorov. Fedorov had been abducted by approximately 10 Russian soldiers on March 11th, taken away in a hood. It was later announced that he had been taken to Luhansk to stand trial. Admittedly, we assumed the worst would become of Fedorov, and we apologize for taking an alarmist stance. However, we are happy to be wrong. It was announced today, March 16th, that Fedorov had been released from captivity, but not by the Russians. Deputy head of the Office of the President, Kirilo Timoshenko said via Telegram, quote, "The special operation to release the mayor of Mariupol, Ivan Fedorov, has just been successfully completed. Vanya is safe. We have just talked to the president and the head of the office," end quote. He then assured that Fedorov would resume his duties as Mariupol's mayor. Fedorov's release was not due to negotiation with Russian military, rather it was the result of a Ukrainian military operation to rescue him. In Chernobyl, northern Ukraine, one of the first targets of the Russian invasion captured 3 weeks ago, over 100 staff, technicians, and security guards alike have been held captive for the entire duration of the Russian occupation of the facility. The wife of a technician said, quote, "They think that no one cares about them, neither the Russian government nor the Ukrainian government. They can take a shower, but with no soap, no shampoo. They can't brush their teeth. They can't change their clothes or wash them. There's simply no supply of medicines. They are sleeping on the floor, on some desks, or on chairs," end quote. Those held captive at the plant are allowed to use the phones, which they use to call their families. Staff are being held at gunpoint, monitoring critical equipment to ensure the site stays safe. We previously reported that a main power outage had jeopardized water pumps in the large pool where spent fuel rods are held. At first, the struggle was to coordinate with Russian forces to allow utility crews to repair the main power line. The plant had been running on generator power with only approximately 48 hours of fuel. The power has since been restored, but then it went out. According to the Kiev Post, quote, "Electricity was cut to Chernobyl on several occasions since the Russian takeover," end quote. It's unclear why Russia has targeted Chernobyl. No statements have been given. However, it is still the task of the Ukrainians working there to ensure its safety is maintained. In U.S. news, March 16, 2022, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky held a virtual meeting with a joint session of Congress. Zelensky opened with his repeated call for a no-fly zone over Ukraine, something the U.S. and its NATO allies have little appetite for. Zelensky has offered an alternative, has continued to offer the same alternative. If you can't enact a no-fly zone, then send in aircraft. Poland had previously offered up almost 30 of its stock of MiG-29 fighter jets, but the U.S. rejected the offer because it would potentially escalate the conflict with Russia. Russia has said they would view such aid as direct conflict with Russia itself. Mitt Romney, the Republican senator from Utah, made his stance clear nearly a week ago when Poland initially made the offer, saying on March 10th, quote, "I simply do not understand the logic for not getting the MiGs to the Ukrainians immediately. There is no logic which has been provided to this committee or to the nation for the lack of rapidity in making this decision. It makes no sense." He added, "What happens in Ukraine could spread to other places," end quote. Zelensky's meeting with Congress ended with a long montage of many of the atrocities committed by Russian forces during their 3-week war. Images of war interspersed with peacetime footage, pristine, tourist-ready images juxtaposed with the war-strewn rubble of its stately buildings. Zelensky concluded, quote, "Today the Ukrainian people are defending not only Ukraine. We are fighting for the values of Europe and the world, sacrificing our lives in the name of the future. That's why today the American people are helping not just Ukraine, but the world to keep the planet alive, to keep justice in history." He added, "As the leader of my nation, I am addressing President Biden. You are the leader of the nation. I wish you to be the leader of the world. Being the leader of the world means to be the leader of peace. Thank you. Slava Ukraini." And now, news of dissent in Moscow. March 14th, 2022, 9:35 p.m. Moscow time. During an evening broadcast on Russia's Channel 1, a state-run television station, news editor Marina Ovsyannikova walked into the background on live television and held up a sign reading, "No war, don't believe the propaganda, here you are being lied to, Russians against war." She also shouted, "Stop the war, no war." She was wearing a red, white, yellow, and blue necklace, a symbol of the unity between Russia and Ukraine. The broadcast was cut in less than 5 seconds, but the sign was legible, and her words were clear. Lev Schlossberg, Russian opposition politician, said, quote, "5 seconds of truth can wash away the dirt of weeks of propaganda," end quote. Ovsyannikova was detained immediately and taken to Ostankino police station. Her lawyers were unable to locate her for more than 12 hours. Ovsyanikova's mother is Ukrainian, her father Russian. In a recorded statement prior to the broadcast, she said she felt shame for having spread Kremlin propaganda. Quote, "I'm embarrassed for letting them tell lies on the TV screen. I'm ashamed that I allowed them to zombify people." End quote. She detailed her time in prison in a brief interview. She was interrogated for 14 hours straight, unable to call her family. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Earlier this month, the Kremlin passed a law making it illegal to independently report on the war and illegal for its citizens to protest the war and illegal to call the war a war. Russia's Federal Investigative Committee is now in control of the case for the state. It's expected that charges against her will be a direct result of the recently enacted law, which carries a maximum sentence of 15 years. On Tuesday, March 15th, appearing in a Moscow courtroom with human rights attorney Anton Gushinsky, Ovsyannikova was given the opportunity to publicly retract her anti-war statements. She refused. Her appearance on national TV is being treated as an unauthorized event or demonstration, but it's a pre-recorded message that was released on the messaging app Telegram that may result in a harsh sentence. In it, she said, "What is happening in Ukraine is a crime. Russia is an aggressor country, and the responsibility for this aggression rests on the conscience of only one person. That person is Vladimir Putin. My father is Ukrainian, my mother is Russian, and they've never been enemies. This necklace that I'm wearing is a symbol of that fact, that Russia must immediately end this fratricidal war and our fraternal peoples will still be able to reconcile. Unfortunately, I've spent the last few years working for Channel 1 doing Kremlin propaganda, and I'm very ashamed of this. Ashamed that I allowed lies to be broadcast from TV screens. Ashamed that I allowed others to zombify Russian people. We were silent in 2014 when all this started. We didn't protest when the Kremlin poisoned Navalny. We just silently watched this inhuman regime at work. And now the whole world has turned its back on us, and the next 10 generations won't wash away the stain of this fratricidal war. We Russians are thinking and intelligent people. It's in our power alone to stop this madness. Go protest. Don't be afraid of anything. They can't lock us all away." End quote. That does it for the March 16th, 2022 recap on the war in Ukraine. We encourage you to check out helpingtoleave.org. That's an independent network of Russian activists who are actively helping Ukrainians get medical aid, food, clothing, and even escape Ukraine. As in, they're doing it right now, as we speak. It's a network of over 300 volunteers all around the world, coordinating together in a Telegram channel to make sure Ukrainians get the help they need. helpingtoleave.org. One last thing, we need to make a correction to our reporting for this episode. We did not have a clear understanding of the circumstances that resulted in the release of Mariupol Mayor Ivan Fedorov. We incorrectly stated that his release was due to a special military operation and not negotiations. That was incorrect, and actually the opposite is true. Ivan Fedorov was released from custody in exchange for 9 captured Russian conscripts. We did not know this until after we'd already published the episode.